Welcome, one and all, to the first ever episode of the Shakespeare Showdown show. This is a new show that compares, contrasts, and analyzes different versions of a Shakespeare play and matches them against each other in a competitive tournament of survival. My name is Mike, and I will be serving as host. The subject of our first tournament, which we are starting today, will be Romeo and Juliet, and competing will be 10 different versions of that play. The tournament will have a total of 9 rounds. In each round, we will make one elimination. This episode is episode number 1 and round 1 of the Romeo and Juliet Showdown. In this episode, we'll be doing 3 things. First, we'll be introducing all 10 of our contestants. These will be the 10 different versions of Romeo and Juliet that will be under consideration in this tournament. Our 10 contestants will include 4 movie versions of the play, 2 television versions, and 4 theater versions, which were performed on stage and recorded. The way that we'll introduce each of these is we'll be looking at Act 1, Scene 1, and specifically within that scene, we'll be studying the prince's speech, which begins with the line, "Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace." That speech will be the main focus of our study today, although we'll also be looking at other details from Act 1, Scene 1, including at least 2 cases of men getting kicked in the groin, so stay tuned for that. The second thing that we'll be doing in this episode as we study Scene 1.1 is we'll be creating a short list of guidelines that will serve as a basic judgment criteria for the tournament. These will be guidelines pertaining to what decisions are or aren't desirable for a treatment of a Shakespeare play. So for example, things like cutting lines out of the play or adding new lines into the play and so forth. Some of these actions we will see can be very positive and creative, while others can be more questionable. But in order for our tournament to work, we need to establish some basic set of guidelines to determine who should get eliminated. So we'll be compiling those guidelines in this round. Third and finally in this episode, we'll be making our first tournament elimination, thereby reducing the number of contestants from 10 to 9. The remaining 9 contestants, as well as the remaining scenes of the play, will be further examined in subsequent rounds of the tournament in later episodes. So, without further ado, let's begin the Romeo and Juliet Showdown by introducing our first contestant. Our contestants will be introduced in chronological order, and our first contestant is a movie version. It is the 1936 MGM movie called Romeo and Juliet. Now, neither Romeo nor Juliet, the characters, are going to be in anything that we look at in this episode. But for the sake of being informative and thorough, I will be giving the names of the actors and actresses starring in the lead roles as part of our introductions. So, the 1936 movie is the movie that stars Leslie Howard as Romeo and Norma Shearer as Juliet. It is directed by George Cukor. We will refer to this contestant as the 1936 MGM movie. So, we're going to listen to the prince's speech from this movie. But first, let's do a brief review to set up what's happening when the prince enters the scene. The scene begins in a public place in Verona with 2 servants from the house of Capulet. 2 servants from the house of Montague arrive, and the 2 groups tease each other into a fight. As the fight escalates, 2 men named Benvolio and Tybalt enter the scene, Benvolio on the side of the Montagues, he's Romeo's cousin, and Tybalt on the side of the Capulets, he's Juliet's cousin. Next, Lord Capulet and his wife Lady Capulet are drawn out of their house, followed shortly thereafter by Lord Montague and his wife Lady Montague. And then ultimately, the prince, who is the highest-ranking figure in the play, arrives and gives this speech, which looks like this. And this is where we will begin our analysis. In this movie, this will be Conway Turrell playing the part of the prince. Let's listen.
Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace. Will you not hear?
Stop. So, to interject, after only one line, we already have our first example of a major edit to the text, which is a cut. The prince's second line, as you see it written here, should be, "Profaners of this neighbor-stained steel." But in this movie, that line is cut out. So what we're going to show is the text in its full form, but with the parts that are not included faded out, like this. So the faded lines are the ones that are missing. Now we're going to continue with the speech, but before we do that, we need to talk for a minute about this action of cutting out lines. As far as the Shakespeare Showdown show is concerned, cutting out lines from the text is a perfectly reasonable and acceptable action to take. So we'll go ahead and begin our list of guidelines, and we'll make our first guideline, which is that cutting lines is okay. Why is this okay? Because this action is so extremely common, especially for movies, that there's simply no escaping it. It's also fairly necessary, especially for movies. The reason it's extremely common and fairly necessary for movies is because it shortens the length of the play and therefore the runtime of the movie, which Alfred Hitchcock famously said should be directly related to the endurance of the human bladder. Now, I'm no expert, but as I understand it, the runtime of Shakespeare's plays when they were first performed during Shakespeare's lifetime was more or less similar to the runtime of a modern movie, but that's only because the speaking tempo of the players was much, much faster than what modern audiences expect to hear. When you consider that a modern audience expects a certain presentation style that includes not just a slower tempo but a lot of other time-consuming elements, such as dramatic establishing shots and things of that nature, cuts simply become necessary to keep the length around 2 to 2.5 hours. This movie is about 2 hours and 5 minutes, and we are saying that lines being cut is okay. However, we understand that cutting lines will have consequences. For instance, if a character only has one line, then cutting that line out will eliminate the whole character. Likewise, if you cut out all the lines in a scene, then you're cutting out the entire scene. So, if we're saying that it's okay to remove lines, then we're also saying it's okay to remove entire characters, scenes, etc. None of these actions are objectionable by themselves. Removing an extremely minor line or an extremely minor character naturally will have an extremely minor impact, but the impacts can become more critical depending on what's being cut. The line, "Profaners of this neighbor-stained steel," in this case, while it is nice when you can get it, isn't the most important line in the play. But when I buy a ticket to see Romeo and Juliet, I better hear Juliet say, "Parting is such sweet sorrow," or else I'll feel like I didn't get my money's worth. So, we're going to add a small caveat to this guideline, and that caveat will be that cutting lines is acceptable only as long as nothing too crucial is lost. Crucial in terms of plot, in terms of theme, in terms of sheer popularity, anything. I suppose it's a matter of opinion what counts as crucial and what doesn't, and that's something that we'll be debating the finer details of on a case-by-case basis in this show. For now, we'll leave it at this. Cutting is okay as long as nothing too crucial is lost. And these are all merely guidelines after all. With all that said, let's return to the prince's speech. We'll start the speech again from the top. The lines that aren't faded are the ones that are included. Let's listen.
Rebellious subjects! Enemies to peace! Will you not hear? What ho, ye men! You beast! On pain of torture, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground. And hear the sentence of your moved prince. 3 civil brawls, bred of an airy word by thee, old Capulet, and Montague have thrice disturbed the quiet of our street. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. For this time, all the rest depart away. You, Capulet, shall go along with me. And Montague, come you this afternoon to know our further pleasure in this case. Once more, on pain of death, all men depart.
Okay, so now let's talk for a minute about what the prince is actually saying here, story-wise. The speech here sets an important tone for the rest of the play. The two households are not only disdainful of each other, but their mutinous violence is spilling over onto the innocent civilians of Verona. And they, as well as the prince, most important of all, are becoming increasingly resentful towards both houses. So the prince's annoyance here should be obvious, and his high authority in Verona should also be obvious. His proclamation of a death sentence for disturbing the public peace will be of the utmost importance in the third act. So if we were to mark a part of this speech as the most crucial part, it would be these lines here. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. Because these are the ones where the prince means pure business. And these are the ones that mustn't be removed. And in this version, thankfully, they aren't. What else are we looking for from the prince, performance-wise? I would say we are looking for a sense of seriousness, a sense of desperation perhaps even a sense of bitterness. Not only is it important to establish tone, but it's also important to be textually correct, and the prince refers to himself as a moved prince. So he should be passionate in his speech here for the sake of accuracy, if nothing else. Keep that in mind as we examine all of our contestants. Overall, I think this was a pretty good version. Heavily abridged would be my only complaint, but they did keep the key lines in, so they get credit for that. I especially like the prince's shiny helmet. With no further guidelines to be made here, and having seen and heard our first speech, let's move on to our second contestant. Our second contestant will be the 1954 movie, also called Romeo and Juliet, directed by Renato Castellani, starring Lawrence Harvey as Romeo and Susan Schenthal as Juliet. This movie won the Golden Lion, the top prize at the Venice Film Festival. We will refer to this contestant as the 1954 Renato Castellani movie. The prince's speech from this version actually has a pretty big maneuver done to it, which is that some of the lines will come in a different order. These are the lines here that are included, but the three lines that begin with three, by, and have actually come before the three lines that begin with on, throw, and. So the speech will actually look like this. Let's go ahead and listen to how this sounds. This is Giovanni Rota playing the prince.
Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, profaners of this neighbor-stained steel.
Stop. I told you the profaners line was a nice line when you can get it. Anyway, once again, starting from the top.
Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, profaners of this neighbor-stained steel. Will they not hear? But oh, you men, you beasts, that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins. 3 civil brawls bred of an airy word by thee, old Capulet and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets. On pain of torture from those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground, and hear the sentence of your moved prince. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace.
So the prince here speaks with great authority, if not great desperation. I think one of the best things about this speech is the nice echo effect that it has in this big forum area, or whatever this is. Another thing that stands out to me, the way the speech is done here, is that it's clearly after the brawl in the street is over. The prince is now lecturing Lord Capulet and Lord Montague privately in a separate location, after the violence has cooled down. It makes the line, will they not hear, less about if they can physically hear him because of the commotion, and more about a long, ongoing pattern of defiance. Also, the line, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground, has a new meaning. Lord Capulet and Lord Montague obviously aren't holding any weapons, so the prince means it in the broader, more metaphorical sense, and it works. What do we have to say about the rearrangement of lines here? Well, for one thing, it puts the line, "and hear the sentence of your moved prince," immediately before the two key lines which constitute the prince's sentence. So in that sense, the rearrangement actually is really effective. In fact, let's go to our list of guidelines and make a new guideline about it. What we'll say is that the rearrangement of lines is also okay, and we'll call this copying and pasting lines. So we'll say that cutting lines is okay, and copying and pasting lines is also okay. And there's actually another example of this from scene 1.1 in this movie, which I wanted to show. If we rewind the tape a little bit to a little bit before the entrance of the prince, we will see the entrance of Lord Capulet. And when Lord Capulet enters the scene, he has the line, as it appears in the text, "Give me my long sword, ho." But the way this movie does it is a little different. Let's watch this and see how they do it. This is the entrance of Lord Capulet.
"Give me my sword! Give me my sword! Give me my long sword, ho!"
So instead of saying, "Give me my long sword, ho," Lord Capulet says, "Give me my sword only." And when someone hands him a sword that he doesn't like, he says it again, and he gets another sword that he doesn't like, and then he finally says, "Give me my long sword, ho," emphasizing the long. So they take a little creative liberty here, and it's done for a mild comedic effect. And they do it all with just the line, "Give me my long sword, ho." But it's nothing more than simply cutting, copying, and pasting. And we are saying that all of these actions are okay. However, we need to add another caveat. The caveat this time will be that copying and pasting is okay, but there must be some creative justification for it. The creative justification for what we saw, in this case, as I said, was a mild comedic effect. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Mild comedic effects are perfectly fine comedic effects. I think it's great. So we now have our first two guidelines and our first two caveats. Now we're cooking. So, having seen and heard the 1954 speech, plus one extra detail from that movie, and having established one more guideline, we will now move on to our third contestant, which is the 1968 movie directed by Franco Zeffirelli, starring Leonard Whiting as Romeo and Olivia Hussey as Juliet. We'll call this movie the 1968 Franco Zeffirelli movie. In this version, this is what the speech looks like. There's not much to discuss here text-wise. It's heavily abridged once again, which all movie versions are bound to be. When we get to our TV versions, we'll get some more complete versions of the speech. But this is how the speech looks. Let's hear how it sounds. This will be Robert Stevens as the Prince from the 1968.
"Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground!
Down with your weapons! Down, I say! Down!
And hear the sentence of your moved prince. 3 civil brawls, bred of an airy word by thee, old Capulet. And Montague have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. For this time, all the rest depart away. You, Capulet, shall go along with me. And Montague, come you this afternoon. Once more, on pain of death, All men depart!
Acting wise, I think this is really solid. It's probably the most agitated version of the prince that we've heard yet. And this is the second time that we've seen horses, which I didn't mention in the 1936 version. This is a big advantage that you get with movie versions that you don't get with stage versions. Horses can add a lot of horsepower, if you'll pardon the expression. It makes me wonder, in fact, if such a thing would be at all feasible for a performance on stage in a theater. I think a horse on stage would be very impressive. I think what would be even more impressive, and at least as plausible on paper, is if you could somehow put the prince on top of an even larger animal, like, say, a circus elephant. If you could somehow manage to hide it from public knowledge until the night of the play, I think it would make for a big surprise, although I certainly wouldn't want to be the one responsible if the thing went on a rampage. But anyway, this 1968 movie is a very famous version of the play. It was probably the most well-known version for the better part of 3 decades, until the 1996 movie was made. This was, in fact, the first version that I personally ever saw, as it was shown to us in my 9th grade English class when I was 15 years old, with my 9th grade English teacher censoring the nudity with a 3-ring binder. The soundtrack is excellent, and it heavily employs, I believe, mostly Renaissance-era instruments, like jingle bells and things like that. We will have a lot more to talk about from this movie in this show, I'm sure of it. For now, I think we can leave it at that. There's no need to create any new rules here. So, moving on to our next contestant, our fourth, we have the 1976 Thames Television version of the play, starring Christopher Neame as Romeo and Anne Hassan as Juliet. You can find this as part of the Thames DVD collection or the Thames Shakespeare collection. We will call it the 1976 Thames TV movie. This is our first television version. This will also be our first full-length version of the play. The 3 movie versions that we've already introduced averaged about 2 hours and 15 minutes in length. This version is 3 hours and change. One good thing about a nice long full-length version that contains every line, or close to every line, is that it's great for reading along with. If you want to read the play and listen to it at the same time, a version like this is really helpful for that. And this will be our first chance to hear a perfectly unabridged version of the prince's speech. But before we get to that, however, I did want to show one funny part at the beginning of the fight here. So, standing here on the left, with the curly hair, is the character Samson, who is a Capulet servant. This is when the fight first breaks out between the Capulet servants and the Montague servants. And Samson here is going to take a kick to the groin. Let's watch this.
I serve as good a man as you.
No better.
Well, sir.
Say better. Here comes one of my master's kinsmen.
Yes. Better, sir.
You lie!
Roar if you be men! Ah! Stand!
Okay, let's rewind and watch that one more time.
Lie!
Roar if you be men! Ah! Stand!
Okay, that was mostly just for our amusement. Moving on to the actual speech by the prince. This will be Peter Donnelly as the prince. Let's listen.
Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, profaners of this naval stained steel, will they not hear? But how, you men? You beasts that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins, on pain of torture! From those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground, and hear the sentence of your morbid prince. 3 civil brawls. Bred of an airy word, by thee, old Capulet and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets, and made Verona's ancient citizens cast by their grave beseeming ornaments to wield old partisans in hands as old, cankered with peace, to part your cankered hate. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. For this time, all the rest depart away. You, Capulet, shall go along with me. And Montague, come you this afternoon to know our further pleasure in this case to Old Free Town, our common judgment place. Once more, on pain of death, all men depart.
So I think it's easy to see here that there is a difference that exists between movie versions and TV versions. A certain trade-off happens. TV versions will have a smaller budget, so they will be less grandiose in certain respects, such as the scale of the sets, maybe the quality of the costumes. This version has no shiny armor that the 1936 had, and obviously there are no horses in this version. Maybe the music isn't as good in TV versions. All of this can be a good thing because it means that TV versions are forced to be interesting in other ways. For instance, in this version, I very much like the dog barking at the beginning. That adds a lot to the highly anxious and chaotic mood. I also really like how that sound went away, directing everyone's attention to the prince completely, giving the prince a certain aura of power. Little things like that can be very effective. Besides that, I also just really appreciate the commitment to give us a proper unabridged version of the speech. It's nice to have at least one version like that. And that's all that I have to say about this version. So, with no more farther pleasure to discuss, as the prince would say, let's move on to our fifth contestant. Our fifth contestant will be another made-for-television version. This will be the 1978 BBC television version from only 2 years later. So, some background about this version. From 1978 to 1984, the BBC did a full set of Shakespeare's plays. And by full set, that is to say 37 plays in total, not including the Two Noble Kinsmen or Edward III, which the Shakespeare Showdown show agrees with as a quote-unquote full set. Romeo and Juliet was actually their first entry in this series, airing on TV in the UK on December 3rd, 1978. This version stars Patrick Reichart as Romeo and Rebecca Sire as Juliet. We'll call this the 1978 BBC TV movie. This contestant and our previous contestant represent the two TV versions to be featured in our tournament. Besides both being from British television, as well as both being from 1970s British television, there is actually one more thing that they have in common, and that is that the 1978 BBC version also contains a kick to the groin in scene 1.1. So let's go ahead and show the kick to the groin to get it over with. This is what it looks like. Alright, once more. Okay, that's what the BBC kick to the groin looks like. But on a more serious note, this version of the scene has something that makes it unique from the other contestants. And it is something that is much worse than a good old-fashioned kick to the groin. This version is actually going to show a bloody baby. Now, I'm going to show the bloody baby. And I will say at the outset that this is not going to be anything overly gory, because it obviously isn't real. The baby's swaddling clothes are just painted red. But, nevertheless, a bloody baby is a bloody baby, regardless of how fake it looks. So it might be a little disturbing. This is the 1978 BBC Act 1 Scene 1 fight, including the bloody baby. Let's watch. So, as you can see, the bloody baby, as fake as it looks, and I'm glad it looks fake, is still a pretty intense detail as far as marginal, unnecessary details go. This is a marginal detail in the fact that it isn't part of the text of the play, except for maybe the prince making the general comment about bloody hands. He doesn't say anything about a baby. So this is another example of a creative liberty being taken, and I think we have some more guidelines to establish having seen it. There's actually a reason why I showed the bloody baby. It wasn't just for our amusement this time. The question here is what exactly should be allowed in terms of raising the intensity of a scene. I think in one sense, stuff like this is fine and good because it adds a lot of variety. It's very memorable. It also adds to the seriousness of the situation in Verona, which contributes to the tone that we want. But should there be a limit? Well, to answer this question, at this time I would like to turn our attention back to the 1954 Renato Castellani movie, because we need to discuss another detail from that version, one that we didn't discuss before, and that is that in that movie, an actual character dies in the fight scene, and this is the only version in our tournament in which he dies. Or should I say it's the only version where it's confirmed that he dies, by name. It is the character Abraham, who is one of the Montague servants. The way they show it is like this. Abraham, a Montague servant who is wearing blue here, is fighting Samson, who is wearing green. Samson has Abraham pinned to the ground, and Samson is going to bonk Abraham on the head with a stick. This is what it looks like.
Yes, and then when they to the money, I banged my thumb at you. I said, what?
Then there's a somewhat long chase scene through the alleyways of Verona, and as a side note, there's actually a lot of time consumed by this movie with people running around Verona through the various alleyways and so forth. A little bit too much in my opinion, and I say that as someone who really can appreciate a good Verona alleyway. But anyway, the next time we see Abraham is when his body is being carried into this little area here, and someone yells, "A servant to the Capulets has killed Abraham. Abraham has been killed in the piazza by a Capulet." This is what that sounds like.
The servant of the Capulets has killed Abraham. Abraham has been killed on the piazza by a Capulet.
Then Lady Montague comes running in, yelling, "Abraham, Abraham, where's thy man? Where's thy man?" Like this.
Abraham! Abraham! Oh, where's my man? Where's my man?
Now, all of this is a bit problematic in a couple of ways. First, these lines about Abraham being murdered do not appear in the text. These were lines written and inserted into the play specifically for this movie, which is a decision that the Shakespeare Showdown show strongly disapproves of. We already knew that this version took creative license with the text from our previous example, the case of Lord Capulet's longsword, but that was entirely a trick of cutting and pasting. Writing new lines is a different matter entirely. Now, we don't think a couple of harmless lines here and there is the gravest of transgressions, especially during a fight scene. During the fight scene, it's common to hear improvised shouting, like "down with the Montagues, down with the Capulets," things like that. That's totally expected, and it's part of what makes a good high-energy fight scene. But this action does need to be strictly limited, because once you start writing new lines, you're on the path that leads eventually to making a version of the play that's no longer the same play that Shakespeare wrote. Of course, people are free to make whatever play or movie that they want. Romeo and Juliet is a very famous tale. Shakespeare himself borrowed the story from already existing material. This is a well-known fact. We'll talk more about this in a later episode, but in the words of Yale professor Harold Bloom, an admitted bardolator, Shakespeare not only stole his material, but he stole it, quote-unquote, with both hands. At the Shakespeare Showdown show, however, we are not interested in adaptations. The only versions that we're interested in are versions that are faithful to Shakespeare's work, not because Shakespeare's work is sacred, but because Shakespeare's work is simply the topic of the show. Having said that, I don't believe that this Renato Castellani movie is guilty of anything that disqualifies it as a legitimate version of Shakespeare's play. It's a perfectly legitimate Romeo and Juliet, and as such, the Shakespeare Showdown show is including it in our tournament. But the couple of lines that they've added, seemingly throwaway lines though they may be, are concerning, and there do exist other versions of Romeo and Juliet that unfortunately have disqualified themselves for our inclusion, and I'm sure they feel terrible about it. Anyway, let's go to our list of guidelines. The official stance of this show is that writing new lines is not acceptable. And we will add a caveat to this rule, yet again, that says, it is not acceptable unless there is not just some creative justification for it, but abundant creative justification for it. We think that sounds fair. That's the first reason why this sequence is problematic. The second reason it's problematic is because of Abraham's death, which is quite literally a matter of life and death. Killing him changes the death count of the play, and generally speaking, the powers of life and death shouldn't be tampered with. That's just a good general guideline for everything. Now, there's no indication in the play, no direct indication that is, that Abraham was killed in this scene. The only possible argument is that the prince vaguely says that blood has been shed, coupled with the fact that Abraham doesn't have any more lines the rest of the play, which is true, he doesn't. We think that for a character to die, an official character with a name from the character list, it needs to be indicated by either an explicit line of dialogue, like for example when Mercutio dies in Act 3, Benvolio reports that, quote-unquote, brave Mercutio's dead, or by an explicit textual direction, like for example when Juliet dies in Act 5, the text directs that she, quote-unquote, dies. Abraham doesn't have either of these. So we now see the godlike power that comes from cutting or adding lines. It's the power of life and death, and this power, we will say, is reserved for the author of the play. We will say that it's his prerogative and his alone. It may be argued that there does exist some creative justification for killing Abraham here. You could argue, for example, that the prince only makes 3 appearances in the play, in Act 1, in Act 3, and in Act 5. And in both Act 3 and Act 5, it's immediately after someone has been killed. Tybalt and Mercutio in Act 3, and Paris, Romeo and Juliet in Act 5. So it might make some sense that someone dies before his entrance in Act 1 too. But I would argue that any blood spilled in Act 1 should remain marginal and anonymous, because by keeping the Act 1 violence marginal and anonymous, it raises the magnitude by contrast of the Act 3 deaths. And we want the Act 3 deaths to be as high magnitude as possible. In summary of this tangent, the 1954 Renato Castellani movie is a highly free-spirited and somewhat deviant version of the play. Not deviant enough to disqualify it from being one of our 10 selections, but deviant enough to earn it our first elimination nomination, which we will indicate by coloring the title red. The 1954 movie is now officially a nominee for elimination in this round of the tournament. Having done that, let's return to the 1978 BBC TV movie, Home of the Bloody Baby, who is properly anonymous, and we don't know if the baby lives or dies. So let's listen to the prince's speech from this version. This will be Lawrence Naismith playing the prince.
profaners of this neighbor-stained steel! Will they not hear? What ho, you men! You beasts that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins. On pain of torture, from those bloody hands throw your mistempered weapons to the ground and hear the sentence of your moved prince. 3 civil brawls, bred of an airy word by thee, O Capulet, and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets, and made Verona's ancient citizens cast by their grave beseeming ornaments to wield old partisans in hands as old, cankered with peace, to part your cankered hate. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. For this time, all the rest depart away. Capulet, you shall go along with me. Montague, come you this afternoon to hear our father pleasure in this case. Once more, on pain of death, all men depart.
So I think this is a very solid speech. They only cut one line out of 23, the second to last line about Old Freetown, which isn't crucial story-wise, although I do like it. The prince, once again, is on a horse. This time he's the only one on a horse, which is effective because it makes him the tallest out of everyone, although that effect is a little undercut by the fact that there are people in windows above him. I don't think there are any more details to discuss about the BBC version. So let's continue with the analysis with some more contestants. Next, we have, finally, our first theatrical version, properly performed for an audience on stage in a theater. This is the 1992 Stratford Festival play, performed at the Stratford Festival in Stratford, Ontario, Canada. This is available on DVD as part of the Stratford collection. This can be sometimes dated to 1993 instead of 1992, because I believe 1993 is when it aired on TV on CBC, but I'm almost positive that the recording we have is a performance that happened in 1992. So sometimes you'll see it as 93, but we will refer to it as the 1992 Stratford Festival play. This version stars Anthony Simolino as Romeo. Anthony Simolino would later become the artistic director of the Stratford Festival. And we have Megan Follows as Juliet, and she is credited as Megan Porter Follows. In the prince's speech here, we will hear Tim MacDonald as the prince. So let's listen to this, and we'll start this a little bit early because the beginning of the speech is a little quiet. The prince, for the first few lines, is speaking underneath the noise of the crowd, but then he'll get everyone's attention. Let's listen.
You men, you beasts, that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins, on pain of torture. From those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground and hear the sentence of your moved prince. 3 civil brawls, bred of an airy word, by thee, old Capulet, and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. For this time, all the rest depart away. You, Capulet, shall go along with me, and Montague, come you this afternoon. Once more, on pain of death, all men depart.
So there are 2 really good things in this version. The elevated position that the prince takes on what will later be Juliet's balcony is very good. We also get to see and hear our first firearm. The prince's prominent and lofty position, with the addition of the gunshot, really gives a lot of added loftiness and firepower to what he has to say, especially since the underlings beneath him are only armed with swords. The costumes here appear to be updated to a semi-modern style. I'm not sure what this period is exactly. I'm going to call it 20th century before the war. Costumes aren't really my strong area. 20th century before the war is the best that I can do. Other than that, I don't have much more to say. I think it's a very solid version. The anachronism of the gun isn't something that we need to make a whole guideline about, because that has nothing to do with the text, which is what we are mainly focused on. So, no major issues here. All of that is totally fine. Moving on, we have contestant number 7, which is the 1996 movie directed by Baz Luhrmann and starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes as Romeo and Juliet. Sometimes this is called William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, or William Shakespeare's Romeo plus Juliet. We'll just call it the 1996 Baz Luhrmann movie. This version has a totally modern upgrade, meaning up to the 1990s, with all of the swords and daggers now upgraded to guns, and all the horses upgraded to cars. And when I say upgraded, I mean technologically. I don't mean to make a value judgment here. How successful they are in upgrading the play quality-wise will be the topic of discussion. This movie was a very hip and fresh version, intending to appeal to a wide and young audience. The soundtrack is an eclectic mix of classical music and various 90s acts like Radiohead with some original music mixed in as well. This version is going to have a very unique style in our tournament, which we will soon see. I will say that this version is heavily abridged, which isn't ideal, but it's to be expected. In fact, this will be our most heavily abridged version of the prince's speech that we will hear. But the little that we will hear will be highly faithful to the text, which is very much appreciated. I think this was the thinking behind the title William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Calling it William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet was their way of emphasizing that the dialogue will be Shakespeare's words, which we are about to hear. Before we listen to the prince's speech, though, we are going to start back with Lord Capulet's line about the long sword once again, the same part that we heard from the 1954 movie. This is what Lord Capulet's line sounds like in this version.
Give me my long sword, Ho!
Thou shalt not stir 1 foot to seek a foe.
So you'll notice the extra effort being taken to keep the text intact. The longsword here, despite now being a gun, is still called a longsword. Longsword is now the gun's nickname or whatever. I think stuff like this can be cute as long as it isn't too much of a stretch. We're not going to give this version any extra credit points for using guns instead of swords, but we're not going to take away any points either. I will give them a little extra credit for handling it in the way they did, because the way they handled it actually serves as a very important signal to the audience. They're announcing to the audience their intentions in the very first scene, that they're going to be firmly faithful to the text. It's as if to say, look, it's true we're upgrading all the swords to guns and all the horses to cars, and it's going to be heavily abridged, and there's going to be modern music throughout, but rest assured, the dialogue you get will be Shakespeare's words, which is a decision that we respect and appreciate. Actually, they're being more than merely faithful to the dialogue. There's a somewhat clever maneuver that they're employing in this scene. Brian Dennehy here, the actor that says Lord Capulet's line, "Give me my long sword, ho," actually isn't playing Lord Capulet. He's playing Lord Montague. So we'll categorize this action as cutting and pasting. In this instance, it's an example of cutting and pasting across characters. And there's more than enough justification for it, because pay attention to what they do here. What they do is not only do they take Lord Capulet's line, "Give me my long sword, ho," and put it in Lord Montague's mouth, they also pair it with Lady Montague's line, which really is Lady Montague's line, "Thou shalt not stir one foot to seek a foe." This line by Lady Montague normally is supposed to appear 5 lines after the longsword line in response to something else that Lord Montague says. Lord Montague is supposed to come out of his house and say, "Thou villain Capulet," and then say to his wife, "Hold me not, let me go," to which his wife, Lady Montague, says, "Thou shalt not stir one foot to seek a foe." What this version does, by putting these 2 lines together, Lord Capulet's line that ends in ho, spoken by Lord Montague here, and Lady Montague's line that ends in foe, is create a brand new rhyming couplet that, in addition to rhyming, can also be in perfect 10-syllable pentameter if you include Lord Capulet's phrase, "What noise is this?" If you include the phrase, "What noise is this?" then you'll have exactly 20 syllables. This movie regrettably doesn't include the phrase, "What noise is this?" so it misses the opportunity to make a perfect 20 syllables, but it still creatively matches Lord Capulet's line ending in ho with Lady Montague's line ending in foe to create a brand new rhyme. Let's listen to this once again.
Give me my long sword, ho!
Thou shalt not stir one foot to seek a foe.
Now, I should also say that this movie isn't being totally original here. This maneuver has been done before, and you can do it in 2 ways. You can either give Lord Capulet's line to Lord Montague, or you can give Lady Montague's line to Lady Capulet. Either way works. Or I suppose you could just have Lady Montague and Lord Capulet coming out of the same house together. That would put a new spin on things. Anyway, it can be a nice little surprise for those who are paying attention. And it says to the audience, to those who are paying attention, relax, enjoy the show, because we've done our homework and you're in good hands. It's very nicely done. Having examined that sequence, let's move on to the prince's speech. The prince here, played by Vondie Curtis Hall, is going to be in a helicopter. Speaking of lofty positions, let's watch this.
Enemies to peace! Throw your mistempered weapons to the ground! On pain of torture from those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground!
3 civil brawls, bred of an airy word by the old Capulet, and Montague have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace.
So, pretty serious delivery by the prince, faithful to the text, except for that one line is repeated twice, which is fine. Again, it's a little too heavily abridged for my taste, but they kept the key lines in. So, no critical problems with this contestant. Not yet. For our next contestant, which is our 8th, we will be looking at something unique yet again, which is the performance from Shakespeare's Globe Theatre from 2009. This performance stars Adetomiwa Adun as Romeo and Ellie Kendrick as Juliet. It is directed by Dominique Dromgoole. Shakespeare's Globe in London is a replica of the original Globe Theatre, the original burning down in the year 1613. This theatre is known for, with notable exceptions, its highly traditional style of performances, of which this contestant is an example. I call it highly traditional because it isn't a strictly originalist performance. A strictly originalist performance wouldn't have female actresses, for one thing. So this version is old-fashioned in some ways, but not in every way. I actually think that a version like this one, with traditional costumes and with female actresses playing the female parts, strikes the perfect balance, because you get every scene in the correct order, which is almost never true for movies, and you get some really awesome female performances. We'll call this version the 2009 Shakespeare's Globe play. Let's dive right in, shall we, to the prince's speech, and we will have a lot to talk about after hearing it. This is what it looks like, and this will be Andrew Vincent as the prince. Let's listen.
Capulet! Hold me not, let me go!
Thou shalt not stir 1 foot to seek a foe!
Rebellious subjects! Enemies to peace! Profaners of this neighbour's stained steel! Will they not hear? What ho! You men! You beasts! On pain of torture, from those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground and hear the sentence of your moved prince! 3 civil broils, bred of an airy word, by thee, O Capulet, and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets, and made Verona's ancient citizens cast by the grade beseeming ornaments, to wield old partisans, in hands as old cankered with peace, to part your cankered hate. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the ransom of your fault. For this time all the rest depart away. You, Capulet, shall go along with me. And Montague, come you this afternoon to know our father pleasure in this case. Once more, on pain of death, all men depart!
So you should notice here some small deviations. The prince, instead of saying 3 civil brawls, says 3 civil broils. Also, instead of saying your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace, he says your lives shall pay the ransom of your fault. That deviation maybe not so small, because that was one of our key lines. This isn't a problem, in fact, because brawls and broils are both valid words to be said here. The word brawls is what's written in an early printed version of the play known as the Second Quarto, also known as the Q2, from the year 1599. The word broils is what's written in another early printed version of the play known as the First Folio, printed in 1623. And there are inconsistencies between these two versions of the play. Neither one is necessarily more accurate or more correct than the other one. It's simply a matter of preference. The popular consensus, however, is that the Q2 from 1599 is the best version, and most performances, as we've seen, follow that text and say brawls instead of broils. But once again, neither is invalid. They simply represent two versions of the play that were printed by different people at different times. Much can be written and debated about this, and much has been written and debated about it, but the Shakespeare Showdown show will try to avoid getting embroiled in such debates. If I personally had to choose between brawls and broils, I would choose broils, but it's not a massively important distinction. The oxymoron of civil brawls remains intact either way, because broils and brawls mean the same thing essentially. It's not worth making a whole guideline about, but it is noteworthy, because sometimes the differences will be more crucial. So it's a good thing that this version went in this direction, because it gave us a chance to talk about it. As for the much bigger deviation, saying ransom of your fault instead of forfeit of the peace, that phrase, ransom of your fault, isn't in the First Folio or in the Q2. That phrase is actually from yet another version of the text, which is the First Quarto, aka the Q1, printed in 1597. So there are three principal textual sources to be aware of. The Q1 from 1597, the title page of which looks like this, the Q2 from 1599, the title page of which looks like this, and the first folio from 1623, the title page of which looks like this. The first folio actually follows the Q2 pretty closely. It's the Q1 that's the least similar to the other two. The Q1 is also known as the bad quarto, making the Q2 the good quarto. The version of the Prince's Speech that we heard from the 2009 play isn't how it's written in any of these texts, because broils is only from the first folio, the other two both having the word brawls, and the phrase ransom of your fault is only from the Q1, the other two both having the phrase forfeit of the peace. So this 2009 play actually does the Prince's Speech like a Frankenstein's monster. It's made from all different sources stitched together. For the record, concerning the phrase forfeit of the peace, the Shakespeare Showdown show strongly prefers forfeit of the peace more than ransom of your fault, although it is good to hear the less common version from time to time. So my preferred version would be a strictly first folio version that includes both broils and forfeit. I would actually be very interested in hearing a possible phrasing of ransom of the peace, which I've never heard before, and I might not like it when I actually heard it, but I would find it interesting. In summary, if you hear differences between versions, this may be the reason, so it's something to keep an eye on. And that's all that we'll say regarding the 2009 speech. Our next contestant, contestant number 9, will be the 2013 Broadway stage play directed by David Leveaux, starring Orlando Bloom as Romeo and Condola Rashad as Juliet. This was performed at the Richard Rodgers Theater in New York City. We will refer to this version as the 2013 Broadway play. This is what the Prince's Speech looks like, and let's dive right in with Jeffrey Owens playing the Prince. This is what it sounds like.
Hold me not, let me go!
Thou shalt not stir a foot to seek a foe!
Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, profaners of this neighbor standing still, will they not hear? What ho, you men, you beasts, that quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins? On pain of torture, from those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground, and hear the sentence of your moved prince. 3 civil brawls, bred of an airy word by thee, old Capulet, and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. For this time all the rest depart away, you, Capulet, shall go along with me. And Montague, come you this afternoon to know our farther pleasure in this case. Once more, on pain of death, all men depart.
Now, this version of the speech is very interesting. By the way, all 10 versions of the speech under consideration in this episode are all different. No two are exactly alike, in terms of which lines are included and which lines aren't. We are examining 10 unique versions of the same speech. And this version is unique and interesting because of the fact that it represents the best example of an averaged version of the speech. And when I say averaged, I don't mean that the quality is mediocre. I mean it's the perfect representation of what we would get if we wanted a compromised version of the speech from all 10 of our contestants that included the lines that are most often included and excluded the lines that are most often excluded. The 5 lines that get cut in this version, the 4 in a row that end with citizens, ornaments, old, and hate, plus the second to last line, are the 5 lines that are most frequently excluded amongst our 10 contestants. And they're also the 5, and the only 5, that are excluded more often than not, or in other words, more than half the time. So if we wanted a version that represented all 10 speeches averaged out, this would be that exactly. I don't think it's a coincidence, therefore, that this version of the speech is a very enjoyable version. I might even go so far as to say that it's probably the closest to the official Shakespeare Showdown show preferred version, even though it has brawls instead of broils, but that's one minor thing. The only other possible difference might be that the Shakespeare Showdown show official preferred version would also include the second to last line, "To old Freetown, our common judgment place," because that's a really cool sounding line that's almost always removed. No contestant has that version exactly, which is disappointing, but this is probably the closest, so they did a good job. Moving on to our 10th and final contestant, we have the 2018 play performed by the Royal Shakespeare Company at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-on-Avon in England. Last but certainly not least. This performance stars Bally Gill as Romeo and Kendra Fishwick as Juliet. It is directed by Erica Wyman. We will refer to this contestant as the 2018 Royal Shakespeare Company play, or the 2018 RSC play for short. Plays performed at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, for better or for worse, are far less bound to traditionalist practices than the ones at Shakespeare's Globe. That will be abundantly clear as we listen to a prince who, in this production, will be played, this time, by a female actress. The name of the actress is Beth Cordingley. Let's listen to her version.
Villain Capulet, hold me not! Let me go!
Thou shalt not stir a foot to seek a foe!
Rebellious subjects, enemies to peace, profaners of this neighbour-stained steel, will they not hear? What ho! You men! You beasts! That quench the fire of your pernicious rage with purple fountains issuing from your veins. On pain of torture, from those bloody hands, throw your mistempered weapons to the ground. And hear the sentence of your moved prince. 3 civil broils, bred of an airy word by thee, old Capulet, and Montague, have thrice disturbed the quiet of our streets, and made Verona's ancient citizens to wield old partisans in hands as old, cankered with peace, to part your cankered hate. If ever you disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. You, Capulet, shall go along with me, and Montague, come you this afternoon, to know our further pleasure in this case.
I think this decision to have a female prince goes beyond the scope of simply cutting and pasting. It will warrant its own guideline. So let's go to our guidelines. The guideline will be that gender switches are okay. They are. Having said that, however, it does raise certain questions which we need to talk about, and we're going to need to add yet another caveat. First of all, let me just say there's nothing wrong with the prince being a woman, politically speaking. Shakespeare's own monarch was Queen Elizabeth I, after all, but it does raise questions such as, if a character that is usually male is played by a woman, does that now mean that the character is now a woman, or is it still a male character just played by a woman? And does that even matter? In the case of the prince in Romeo and Juliet, we don't think it really matters. But you can easily imagine that in other circumstances, in other plays, doing a gender switch can have a bigger impact. In Twelfth Night, for example, where there are love triangles and twin siblings and so forth, a gender switch can have big plot consequences, to say nothing of the consequences to the themes, which are at least as important as the plot. So in certain cases, it may matter. So we will add a caveat that we understand that it may have consequences, and it's okay as long as it doesn't cause major negative complications. To answer the question, is this prince now a woman? Well, she does still refer to herself as a prince, as opposed to a princess, although that could simply be for the sake of preserving the number of syllables. There are no pronouns used in this scene, but later in the play, in Act 3, Scene 3, when the friar is reporting to Romeo about the prince's judgment, the friar uses a pronoun in the line, "A gentler judgment vanished from his lips," and in this version of the play, the friar says this line as "from her lips," which is confirmation to us that she is indeed a woman, and that their decision apparently is to switch the actor, who is traditionally a man, to a woman, as well as switch the prince's character, also from a man to woman, and leave the character's name, or at least their title, as the prince, unaltered. Simple enough. Female actress, female prince, still called a prince. Most gender switches, by the way, will be from male to female, for the simple fact that there are more male roles than female roles, which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody, but in all of Shakespeare's canon, there's actually about 7 times more male roles, which was higher than I expected. One further note about gender switches: we're going to say the same thing about gender switches that we said about the swords and the guns. Extra credit won't be given for this decision by itself. The decision itself isn't hard. In fact, I can do it right now. Listen, Romeo and Juliet, but Romeo is a woman and Juliet is a man. See, it's not that hard. But what have I accomplished? By itself, it's a totally neutral decision. It all depends on what you then actually do with it. For a gender switch alone, no points will be given, and also no points will be taken away. And I think that's the fairest that we can be. So what does this speech do with it? Well, I think I can hear a little something extra in the phrase, "You men, you beasts." Having a female prince now gives an extra flavor to that line. In fact, let's listen to that line once again.
What ho! You men! You beasts!
I think she puts a little extra hot sauce on it. I think that's noticeable. Also, if you noticed, from what we watched before, Lady Montague and Lord Montague have switched their lines, which, since we've introduced gender switches into the mix, this could be taken one of 2 ways. Either they switched lines, or the lines stayed the same and it was their genders that switched. The truth is, according to the credits, the one that says, "Thou shalt not stir a foot to seek a foe," is Lord Montague. So it was their lines that switched. Well, for now at least, that's all we have to say about the 2018 RSC version. Alright, so having introduced all 10 contestants, and having heard 10 different versions of the Prince's speech from Act 1, Scene 1, and having created a short list of guidelines that we will use to begin our Romeo and Juliet analysis, it is now time to make a death sentence of our own, and to make an elimination for this round. We only made one official elimination nominee, which was the 1954 Renato Castellani movie, and so without wasting any time, we will go ahead and eliminate that version from tournament contention, making it the first elimination in our series. We already discussed the things that this movie is guilty of, that it takes too many liberties with the text. Taking a few liberties is fine, but you can't take too many liberties with the liberty taking, as Dr. Fraser Crane once said. But having covered that already, I would like to share some of the positive points about this movie. I think that the Romeo and Juliet characters in this version, which we didn't get the chance to see, are both very likable. They are both played in a way that's very humble, which is an interpretation that is enjoyable, and they also have great chemistry together, which, needless to say, is of the utmost importance. The orchard scene in the second act in particular is very well done. That scene, which we'll be discussing in greater detail in a later episode, is worth mentioning, because the Renato Castellani handling of that scene is very tender, with a lot of excellent details. In fact, we reserve the right to still take a peek at this version of that scene when we get to that topic, even though it's getting eliminated now. This movie received a lot of praise in its day, and it deserved the praise that it received. However, an unfortunate fate for this movie is that it now exists in sort of a blind spot between the 1936 movie and the 1968 movie, because it falls between those two not just chronologically, but also stylistically. On the one hand, for instance, similar to the 1936 MGM movie, it's a very old and classic feeling movie, yet it isn't as classic as the 1936. The 1936 is in black and white. It's got John Barrymore as Mercutio, Basil Rathbone as Tybalt. It's the most classic movie version. And on the other hand, it's also liable to get overshadowed by the 1968 Franco Zeffirelli movie, which is much grittier and has a far superior musical soundtrack. So this version is in a tough spot where it can often get overlooked, maybe forgotten. And that's unfortunate because it's a very lovely version, and it's definitely worth a watch if you've never seen it. In conclusion, we are proud to include the 1954 Renato Castellani movie as one of our 10 contestants, but for the reasons given, reasons having to do with it being the most rebellious subject of all the subjects under scrutiny today, it is our first elimination. On the next episode of the Shakespeare Showdown show, we will be looking at our 9 remaining contestants, and we will be introducing 9 different Romeos along with 9 different Juliets, so we will have a lot of important material to cover. The 2 star-crossed lovers in round 2, 9 pairs of them, next time on the Shakespeare Showdown show. Thanks for watching.